Hello there, dear listeners. And welcome back on a journey around the world in 80 days. When we last saw Mr. Phileas Fogg and Passepartout, they had just arrived to Bombay on the western coast of India. During their ride across the Indian Ocean on board steamboat Mongolia, Mr. Fogg had bribed the vessel's engineer to try to arrive at their destination as fast as possible. And indeed, they had arrived in Bombay 2 whole days before the schedule. While in Bombay, Passepartout got into a little bit of a scuffle with some locals, when he had taken a sightseeing tour in places where he should not have. He got a little bit tussled, and lost his shoes, but was otherwise unharmed and managed to make his way back to the train station. As our story begins, our heroes have boarded the train that will take them all across the Indian subcontinent to Calcutta on the eastern coast of India. So let's go. Chapter 11. In which Phileas Fogg secures a curious means of conveyance at a fabulous price. The train had started punctually. Among the passengers were a number of officers, government officials, and opium and indigo merchants, whose business called them to the eastern coast. Passepartout rode in the same carriage with his master, and a third passenger occupied a seat opposite to them. This was Sir Francis Cromarty, one of Mr. Fogg's whist partners on the Mongolia, now on his way to join his corps at Benares. Sir Francis was a tall, fair man of 50, who had greatly distinguished himself in the last Sepoy revolt. He made India his home, only paying brief visits to England at rare intervals, and was almost as familiar as a native with the customs, history, and character of India and its people. But Phileas Fogg, who was not traveling, but only describing a circumference, took no pains to inquire into these subjects. He was a solid body, traversing an orbit around the terrestrial globe, according to the laws of rational mechanics. He was at this moment calculating in his mind the number of hours spent since his departure from London, and, had it been in his nature to make a useless demonstration, would have rubbed his hands for satisfaction. Sir Francis Cromarty had observed the oddity of his travelling companion, although the only opportunity he had for studying him had been while he was dealing the cards, and between 2 rubbers, and questioned himself whether a human heart really beat beneath this cold exterior, and whether Phileas Fogg had any sense of the beauties of nature. The Brigadier General was free to mentally confess that, of all the eccentric persons he had ever met, none was comparable to this product of the exact sciences. Phileas Fogg had not concealed from Sir Francis his design of going round the world, nor the circumstances under which he set out, and the General only saw in the wager a useless eccentricity and a lack of sound common sense. In the way this strange gentleman was going on, he would leave the world without having done any good to himself or anybody else. An hour after leaving Bombay, the train had passed the viaducts and the island of Salsette, and had got into the open country. At Kalyan they reached the junction of the branch line which descends towards southeastern India by Khandala and Pune, and, passing Towle, they entered the defiles of the mountains, with their basalt bases, and their summits crowned with thick and verdant forests. Phileas Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty exchanged a few words from time to time, and now Sir Francis, reviving the conversation, observed,
"Some years ago, Mr. Fogg, you would have met with a delay at this point which would probably have lost you your wager."
"How so, Sir Francis?"
"Because the railway stopped at the base of these mountains, which the passengers were obliged to cross in palanquins or on ponies to Kandala, on the other side."
"Such a delay would not have deranged my plans in the least,"
said Mr. Fogg.
"I have constantly foreseen the likelihood of certain obstacles."
"But, Mr. Fogg,"
pursued Sir Francis,
"you run the risk of having some difficulty about this worthy fellow's adventure at the pagoda."
Passepartout, his feet comfortably wrapped in his travelling blanket, was sound asleep and did not dream that anybody was talking about him.
"The government is very severe upon that kind of offence. It takes particular care that the religious customs of the Indians should be respected, and if your servant were caught—"
"Very well, Sir Francis,"
replied Mr. Fogg.
"If he had been caught he would have been condemned and punished, and then would have quietly returned to Europe. I don't see how this affair could have delayed his master."
The conversation fell again. During the night the train left the mountains behind, and passed Nasik, and the next day proceeded over the flat, well-cultivated country of the Kaddish, with its straggling villages, above which rose the minarets of the pagodas. This fertile territory is watered by numerous small rivers and limpid streams, mostly tributaries of the Godavari. Passepartout, on waking and looking out, could not realize that he was actually crossing India in a railway train. The locomotive, guided by an English engineer and fed with English coal, threw out its smoke upon cotton, coffee, nutmeg, clove, and pepper plantations, while the steam curled in spirals around groups of palm trees, in the midst of which were seen picturesque bungalows, viharis, sort of abandoned monasteries, and marvelous temples enriched by the exhaustless ornamentation of Indian architecture. Then they came upon vast tracts extending to the horizon, with jungles inhabited by snakes and tigers, which fled at the noise of the train, succeeded by forests penetrated by the railway, and still haunted by elephants which, with pensive eyes, gazed at the train as it passed. The travelers crossed, beyond Milligaum, the fatal country so often stained with blood by the sectaries of the goddess Kali. Not far off rose Ellora, with its graceful pagodas, and the famous Aurungabad, capital of the ferocious Aurangzeb, now the chief town of one of the detached provinces of the kingdom of the Nizam. It was thereabouts that Faringhaya, the Thuggee chief, king of the Stranglers, held his sway. These ruffians, united by a secret bond, strangled victims of every age in honor of the goddess Death, without ever shedding blood. There was a period when this part of the country could scarcely be traveled over without corpses being found in every direction. The English government has succeeded in greatly diminishing these murders, though the Thuggees still exist, and pursue the exercise of their horrible rights. At 12:30 the train stopped at Burhapur, where Passepartout was able to purchase some Indian slippers, ornamented with false pearls, in which, with evident vanity, he proceeded to encase his feet. The travelers made a hasty breakfast and started off for Ashurgar, after skirting for a little the banks of the small river Tapti, which empties into the Gulf of Cambrai, near Surat. Passepartout was now plunged into absorbing reverie. Up to his arrival at Bombay, he had entertained hopes that their journey would end there. But, now that they were plainly whirling across India at full speed, a sudden change had come over the spirit of his dreams. His old vagabond nature returned to him. The fantastic ideas of his youth once more took possession of him. He came to regard his master's project as intended in good earnest, believed in the reality of the bet, and therefore in the tour of the world and the necessity of making it without fail within the designated period. Already he began to worry about possible delays, and accidents which might happen on the way. He recognized himself as being personally interested in the wager, and trembled at the thought that he might have been the means of losing it by his unpardonable folly of the night before. Being much less cool-headed than Mr. Fogg, he was much more restless, counting and recounting the days passed over, uttering maledictions when the train stopped, and accusing it of sluggishness, and mentally blaming Mr. Fogg for not having bribed the engineer. The worthy fellow was ignorant that, while it was possible by such means to hasten the rate of a steamer, it could not be done on the railway. The train entered the defiles of the Sitpur Mountains, which separate the Kaddish from Bundelkund, towards evening. The next day Sir Francis Cromarty asked Passepartout what time it was, to which, on consulting his watch, he replied that it was 3 in the morning. This famous timepiece, always regulated on the Greenwich meridian, which was now some 77 degrees westward, was at least 4 hours slow. Sir Francis corrected Passepartout's time, whereupon the latter made the same remark that he had done to Fix, and upon the general insisting that the watch should be regulated in each new meridian, since he was constantly going eastward, that is in the face of the sun, and therefore the days were shorter by 4 minutes for each degree gone over, Passepartout obstinately refused to alter his watch, which he kept at London time. It was an innocent delusion which could harm no one. The train stopped, at 8 o'clock, in the midst of a glade some 15 miles beyond Rothal, where there were several bungalows and workmen's cabins. The conductor, passing along the carriages, shouted,
"Passengers will get out here."
Phileas Fogg looked at Sir Francis Cromarty for an explanation, but the general could not tell what meant a halt in the midst of this forest of dates and acacias. Passepartout, not less surprised, rushed out and speedily returned, crying,
"Monsieur, no more railway."
What do you mean?
asked Sir Francis.
"I mean to say that the train isn't going on."
The general at once stepped out, while Phileas Fogg calmly followed him, and they proceeded together to the conductor.
Where are we?
asked Sir Francis.
At the hamlet of Colby.
Do we stop here?
Certainly. The railway isn't finished.
What, not finished?
No, there's still a matter of 50 miles to be laid from here to Allahabad, where the line begins again.
but the papers announced the opening of the railway throughout.
What would you have, officer? The papers were mistaken.
Yet you sell tickets from Bombay to Calcutta,
retorted Sir Francis, who was growing warm.
No doubt.
Replied the conductor.
But the passengers know that they must provide means of transportation for themselves from Colby to Allahabad.
Sir Francis was furious. Passepartout would willingly have knocked the conductor down, and did not dare to look at his master.
Sir Francis,
said Mr. Fogg quietly,
we will, if you please, look about for some means of conveyance to Allahabad.
Mr. Fogg, this is a delay greatly to your disadvantage.
No, Sir Francis, it was foreseen.
What? You knew that the way?
Not at all, but I knew that some obstacle or other would sooner or later arise on my route. Nothing, therefore, is lost. I have 2 days, which I have already gained, to sacrifice. A steamer leaves Calcutta for Hong Kong at noon, on the 25th. This is the 22nd, and we shall reach Calcutta in time.
There was nothing to say to so confident a response. It was but too true that the railway came to a termination at this point. The papers were like some watches, which have a way of getting too fast, and had been premature in their announcement of the completion of the line. The greater part of the travelers were aware of this interruption, and, leaving the train, they began to engage such vehicles as the village could provide: four-wheeled palkieres, wagons drawn by zebus, carriages that looked like perambulating pagodas, palanquins, ponies, and what not. Mr. Fogg and Sir Francis Cromarty, after searching the village from end to end, came back without having found anything.
I shall go afoot,
said Phileas Fogg. Passepartout, who had now rejoined his master, made a wry grimace, as he thought of his magnificent, but too frail Indian shoes. Happily he too had been looking about him, and, after a moment's hesitation, said,
Monsieur, I think I have found a means of conveyance.
What?
An elephant. An elephant that belongs to an Indian who lives but 100 steps from here.
Let's go and see the elephant,
replied Mr. Fogg. They soon reached a small hut, near which, enclosed within some high palings, was the animal in question. An Indian came out of the hut, and, at their request, conducted them within the enclosure. The elephant, which its owner had reared, not for a beast of burden, but for warlike purposes, was half domesticated. The Indian had begun already, by often irritating him, and feeding him every 3 months on sugar and butter, to impart to him a ferocity not in his nature, this method being often employed by those who train the Indian elephants for battle. Happily, however, for Mr. Fogg, the animal's instruction in this direction had not gone far, and the elephant still preserved his natural gentleness. Keone, this was the name of the beast, could doubtless travel rapidly for a long time, and, in default of any other means of conveyance, Mr. Fogg resolved to hire him. But elephants are far from cheap in India, where they are becoming scarce. The males, which alone are suitable for circus shows, are much sought, especially as but few of them are domesticated. When therefore Mr. Fogg proposed to the Indian to hire Keone, he refused point blank. Mr. Fogg persisted, offering the excessive sum of £10 an hour for the loan of the beast to Allahabad. Refused. £20? Refused also. £40? Still refused. Passepartout jumped at each advance, but the Indian declined to be tempted. Yet the offer was an alluring one, for, supposing it took the elephant 15 hours to reach Allahabad, his owner would receive no less than £600 sterling. Phileas Fogg, without getting in the least flurried, then proposed to purchase the animal outright, and at first offered £1,000 for him. The Indian, perhaps thinking he was going to make a great bargain, still refused. Sir Francis Cromarty took Mr. Fogg aside, and begged him to reflect before he went any further, to which that gentleman replied that he was not in the habit of acting rashly, that a bet of £20,000 was at stake, that the elephant was absolutely necessary to him, and that he would secure him if he had to pay 20 times his value. Returning to the Indian, whose small, sharp eyes, glistening with avarice, betrayed that with him it was only a question of how great a price he could obtain, Mr. Fogg offered first £1,200, then £1,500, £1,800, £2,000. Passepartout, usually so rubicund, was fairly white with suspense. At £2,000 the Indian yielded.
What a price, good heavens!
Cried Passepartout.
For an elephant.
It only remained now to find a guide, which was comparatively easy. A young Parsee, with an intelligent face, offered his services, which Mr. Fogg accepted, promising so generous a reward as to materially stimulate his zeal. The elephant was led out and equipped. The Parsee, who was an accomplished elephant driver, covered his back with a sort of saddle cloth, and attached to each of his flanks some curiously uncomfortable howdahs. Phileas Fogg paid the Indian with some banknotes which he extracted from the famous carpet-bag, a proceeding that seemed to deprive poor Passepartout of his vitals. Then he offered to carry Sir Francis to Allahabad, which the brigadier gratefully accepted, as one traveller the more would not be likely to fatigue the gigantic beast. Provisions were purchased at Colby, and, while Sir Francis and Mr. Fogg took the howdahs on either side, Passepartout got astride the saddlecloth between them. The Parsee perched himself on the elephant's neck, and at 9 o'clock they set out from the village, the animal marching off through the dense forest of palms by the shortest cut. End of chapter 11. Oh dear, that wasn't at all according to the plan. Well, at least traveling by British rails seems to be as reliable as ever, eh? Jokes aside, I think Jules Verne took a little bit of creative freedom here. This line, between Bombay and Calcutta, or between Mumbai and Kolkata, as they are nowadays called, was indeed opened in 1870. I rather think it was more or less operable from the announcement. After all, it was one of the developments that inspired Verne to write this book. But what do I know? If you are an expert on railways in the Victorian-era British India, drop a comment below. And if you'd like to hear how the story continues, tune in next time.